welcome you. This platform, Future Studio webinar, is available for all those who would like to participate in Armenian English and French. If you want to hear the Armenian interpretation, choose Portuguese. The rest you will find respectively. It's a special recording today. We are in an incessant flow of news, but there is a possibility to look into the depth of the processes that have been taking place for the last 2 weeks, specifically to understand the situation at the moment of its development. There are no simple solutions. And we have just to think and try to understand, and this is truly a priceless opportunity that we are enjoying today due to our guest. I'd like to introduce Mr. Hratchya Arzumanyan, who is a military and security expert. Good evening, Hratchya. Yes, a doctor of political science, PhD in technical science, and also reserve officer of Artsakh Defense Army. I would like to apologize in advance. There may be interruptions in our connection because Hratchya is in Stepanakert right now. As you know, the situation is quite unpredictable. Nevertheless, do not leave the platform. Raja might be changing his location to restore the connection as quickly as possible. My friends, I'm not going to be making any head races, guiding questions. First of all, because I'm not a journalist, and secondly, I'd like to save time and give more time to our expert to answer the questions I have planned for him, and also leave sufficient time for Hratchya to answer the questions that you will be sending us. I can see all those questions. I will be able to see them, and I'd like to mm, ask them in live. Once again, thank you, Hratchya. Nice to see you. Yes, nice to see you too. The first question right away, I suppose, of concern for all of us. So, 12 hours. We had negotiations between the ministers of foreign affairs of Armenia and Azerbaijan. The ceasefire was announced. That had to start several hours ago. 4 points mentioned. Please explain what this ceasefire means and are the parties ready for a truce? Well, we have to accept and understand that this is a humanitarian ceasefire. This is not a final ceasefire. It's kind of a pause for the parties to stop for a second and solve some humanitarian problems. And the centers simply get time to solve through the situation that was unexpectedly established by Turkey and Azerbaijan at the beginning of the military aggression, quite unexpected, by the way, for all the central powers. So now they're getting this interval in order to realize everything that's been happening, and that is happening. After long lasting negotiations in Moscow, certain provisional document was established, and Azerbaijan immediately showed, after signing it into force, that it was not ready to follow it. And the announcement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey showed that the other party is quite skeptical about the fact of signing that document. Well, the Armenian side has to take that into account. Okay, please tell us, what does that mean? Specific parameters or details will be further agreed of the ceasefire. I mean, is that a kind of a trick for Azerbaijan to continue the aggression? Well, I think this is more the demand from the centers of power, the regional and the geopolitical ones. So the actions of Turkey and Azerbaijan were simply unexpected. They are winning time. I mean, Russia, France, and United States are just winning time to understand what they should be doing with the situation that was disrupted by Turkey and Azerbaijan. So ceasefire, just to sit and think while the civilian population is not being shelled. So to think that certain issues have been resolved, no, I don't think so. This is just a ceasefire. And the Armenian side also has time to realize what we have been doing 30 years after the ceasefire of 1994, ceasefire of 2016. So apparently we are doing mistakes because we are getting into the same flow again and again. Okay, then please tell us substantial negotiations. What does that mean? I'm not a military expert. I'm not an expert in international relations or negotiations. What do they mean by substantial? Well, I suppose one of the predicates, just an adjective that could be extensively interpreted, and that parties are going to do that on their own. To go in depth of interpretation of that specific term and build narratives around it is too premature. Our Armenian side will understand one thing under substantial, the other side will understand something else, the third parties will understand it differently. For the Armenian side, that's not relevant because we have to understand how we're going to be solving our military problems. And secondly, what should the reaction be? What should the response be from the Armenian world, the statehood and Armenianhood as a global phenomenon, to understand what was happening to us for 13 days? Okay, we'll go back to that question necessarily a little later in our meeting today. You know, just as all, I'm flowing through this information source, and my sources of information are the government of Artsakh, the government of Armenia, and a number of other Western sources I'm looking at. So I'd like to understand how you think about this. Let's just call the things by their names. What do we have to deal with? What's happening? Because I'm hearing different formulations. Escalation of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenian, Azerbaijani, Turkish war, local resistance. What is it? Well, I think it is necessary to use the predicate, to pronounce it in both. This is both a local issue where Azerbaijan tries to restore its territorial integrity, but it's also a regional war with participation of Turkey trying to solve its issues in the South Caucasus and the Caucasus in general. On the other side, that's also a global war with terrorism because Turkey quite deliberately used the tools of the global jihadism to deploy those in the theater of military actions in this conflict. Ultimately, this local regional also became global conflict, respectively, Artsakh being just a point on the global map at the same time in its magnitude uh, consolidates several conflicts. And the complicated part on the Armenian side, because apart from Turkey, Turkey solves its issues on global issues, Armenian side has to be thinking both on the local, on the regional, and on the global geopolitical levels. So everything that was happening in Artsakh for the last 13 days and everything that's happening now in form of a temporary ceasefire is a complicated military conflict consisting of both local, regional, and also global implications, which means there will be no simple solutions military wise. Doubtlessly, we should be making inferences here, and it's clear that the solution only in military way is simply impossible for such a complicated conflict, and the whole global experience for the last 20 years comes to assert that respectively, we should be solving the issue through diplomatic and political ways. The United States of America, when invading Afghanistan in 2001 and fighting there for 20 years, ultimately ended up with a political regulation. The Middle East, decades in war, ultimately ended up with a political resolution because in such global conflicts, there is no military solution. You're not able to solve it in a military way. And that's when the question is asked, what are the positions of the Armenian side on the political and diplomatic arena? If militarily it's quite simple and understandable, we defend the Armenian land, we defend Artsakh, the Republic of Artsakh, we defend the Republic of Armenia. Very simple military errands. perfectly carried out by Armenian armed forces, but what the tasks for Armenia are and Artsakh on a global platform is a difficult question because Armenian diplomacy got accustomed to quite comfortable existence when Nagorno-Karabakh resolution was being performed as an issue between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That also became part of the history, already became part of history. And the Armenian policies
Мгм.
have to be viewed in a different way by the Armenian
Давайте
people.
поговорим об этом чуть
Okay, let's
позже.
speak of that a little
Скажите,
later.
пожалуйста,
Tell us, please,
зачем? Вот мы понимаем, зачем эта война нужна Азербайджану,
what
да, для
for?
восстановления
Well, we
территориальной
understand what
целостности.
Azerbaijan needs the war for,
По
to
крайней мере,
restore
если
its
мы
territorial
говорим
integrity at least.
об
That's the
этом
postulate on the
конкретно.
part of their government. Why would Turkey need
Каким
that war?
образом на ИС
And
Арцахе
how would that country participate
Хратчя
in it? How
проиграла?
Turkey became an actor and how can that role develop? Well, we will need to analyze the behavior of Turkey in the Middle East for the last several years to understand the answer to that question. Unfortunately, Turkey exceeded the borders of Turkey and now tries to attempts to project its power beyond its borders. So Turkey is revisiting its own role of a state that was built by Ataturk, and now it goes to some other projects, appeals to some global areas of Turkish nation.
Я прошу прощения, коллеги,
I have to apologize, dear friends. We'll wait for the connection to be restored. It is important to understand that those all tasks are
Давайте
global.
поговорим о
Raj,
чем-то
I think we have lost your connection for several seconds. Would you please repeat the last point? Because uh, the connection was bad. Yes. Was it the connection problem? Yes.
Нет, сейчас нормально, сейчас все
No,
хорошо.
it's fine. It's fine now. You can continue.
Если вы меня
All
слышите,
right, then.
как мы познакомились с Храчьян.
Hopefully you do. Let me tell you how
Это
we were
было
acquainted.
полтора года назад, когда мы закончили
About a year and a half ago, we
переводчиком.
completed our work on a manuscript called The Crossroads together with Ruben Vartanian. We sent that work of ours to quite a large number of people to involve them into discussions about the future and get their comments. And to our great surprise, and we're also very grateful, many people responded, many we did not know. So they responded, and uh, including the person who is now asking the question, our distinguished friend Alan Whitehorn from Canada. And Hratchya, yes, by the way, Hratchya, you are now in. While we were getting you back to our meeting, I was telling how we got acquainted, and I was never personally acquainted with. And Hratchya wrote a response, a feedback on our work, not very positive, but quite a critical one. And that's how we got acquainted. So I was just using the live time, but you have to unmute yourself to continue. And let's speak a little more about what was happening with Turkey in the region recently, because this is definitely not the first attempt of expansionistic policies. Well, we have to understand and accept that Turkey moves towards more expansionistic implementation of its projects. What projects those are will be further found out by the Armenian diplomacy, but the important thing is that the vector of Turkish expansion does not move only to the east or to the south, but also to the Caucasus, because I thought personally that Turkey on that level of development would not dare move towards the territory of Russian influence. Well, I was thinking, well, Erdogan is not crazy to get into direct interests of Russia, not Syria or Libya, but Caucasus. And I was mistaken. I can simply confess. Turkey did that, which was unexpected. And ultimately, we have the results that we have. So both Russia and Armenia have to reassess the behavior of Erdogan in the Caucasus. Okay, what are the options? Okay, what errands is he looking at this moment? Well, his errands, his tasks are well, it's quite difficult to try to motivate a person, to justify a person who is not very adequate and is definitely manifesting crazy policies. He has simply surrounded his country by a circle of enemies that want the destruction of Turkey or just changes in what's happening now. But if we try to look at that crazy behavior, then it's quite obvious they want deliberately to come back to the Caucasus. They were present in the Caucasus for centuries, longer than Russia, and Erdogan now simply announces about his goals. Okay, so this way or another, the investments Turkey was making in Georgia and Azerbaijan for the last 10 years were kind of economic expansion, wasn't it? Because we're speaking of completely different things now, but this is a military expansion. Well, yes, economic, financial, other forms of expansion were happening, and they're ultimately comprising the policy of a state. And at a certain phase of its development, Turkey also deploys the military part of it. It's just fine for a state, but the goal of expansion towards the Caucasus is not normal. I mean, it's a reckless decision on the part of Turkey, but we have to emanate from the point that they made that step. Especially Armenia has no other choice. We have to accept the reality as it is. The further Armenian policies and diplomacies have to be built in a completely different context. Tell us, please, it's also a question. So it's been a proven fact that Islamic mercenaries were present in the territory of Azerbaijan. What should they expect there? Well, the jihadists, well, what expects them is quite clear. The psychology the ideology of jihadists simply supposes the end of their life the way it supposes it. But Turkey uses that deliberately as a tool for implementation of its goals and objectives. We've seen that in Syria, in Libya, and why not use that in the Caucasus? It's kind of logical. It's a smart move. It's a different thing that that smart move in the interests of Turkish state turns Azerbaijan into an ignored state that turned its actions into terrorism and ultimately removes the possibility for Azerbaijan to be called a normal state. But that's for Azerbaijan to deal with, and Turkey essentially doesn't care for that. Turkey is interested in Azerbaijan as a platform, part of a larger Turkish project. And it is in the framework of that project, the use of jihadism is a smart move because the presence of jihadists in Azerbaijan allows the possibility of further penetration into the Caucasus, its destabilization, further penetration to the south with the stabilization of Iran, Trans-Caspian penetration, destabilization of Kazakhstan, not only from the south but also on the western borders. So military-wise, or regional tools, essentially, or regional policies, may ultimately destroy Azerbaijan as a state that makes sovereign decisions or says something internationally. So, by its reckless move, Azerbaijan, this is a reckless move for Azerbaijan, not for Turkey. So, Azerbaijan essentially deprives itself of sovereign decision making, and the task for the Armenian diplomacy and the Armenian people to bring that before the attention of the international community. Okay, then let's speak of the following. We're seeing this around on the internet, some photos and maps where Turkey is on one side and Azerbaijan on the other, with all the other Turkic states. And I mean, there's this tiny piece of land, Armenia. So this pan-Turkism ambitions, part of a grander plan by Turkey? What do you think? I mean, there's so many conversations about that. Or maybe They will stop somewhere and they have kind of a final
точка его маршрута.
point of route
Ну, мы должны
on
понять,
this
что мы
journey.
тоже имеем опыт,
Well, we
и
have to understand that we
происходит
Armenians
сейчас
also have rich history and we have certain
в Европе
painful
сейчас,
pages
и мы должны понять, что в
uh,
Турции присутствует несколько
in that
глобальных
history, and we have to
проектов.
understand that
Есть
Turkey has
проект
several global
есть
projects.
проект
First is the pan-Turkic
трансформации
state, re-establishment of the Ottoman Empire, etc.
некоторые дополнительные
Some are
проекты нарабатываются.
competing amongst one
На
another, the
данном
others
этапе мы
are
должны
just
четко
complementing. So, but at this phase, we have to clearly understand
один
that
другой
Turkey solves the issue of
государства.
bringing together
Предложение
two
Турции
states,
требуется
Azerbaijan
создать
and Turkey,
большую
two these
сеть
Turkic states into a kind of a
объединяющих
larger reality,
Турцию и Азербайджан.
unifying Turkey and
Данное решение
Azerbaijan.
запустит
So
более большие проекты,
this
новые
solution
цифровое соглашение,
can be part of larger projects
соглашение
like New Ottoman Empire, Pan-Turkism, etc. But all these kind of
соглашение
projects
станет
are
достаточно
quite
техническим
elusive.
и
They are more
деловым.
theoretical,
И эта задача
maybe
решать
more
очень
nourished by
сложно.
ideologies. And this is a
Крайне
distant
сложно.
future task, not very realistic. So
Это
spending time on these maps,
развивается
showing Pan-Turkism as a seed that will ultimately devour Armenia may be reality, but it's not today. The reality today
объединение
is the
двух
unification of two Turkic
двух
states.
два
That's the
государства, один
motto.
народ
Two states, one
становится
nation
одной
is now being replaced into
государственной
one nation,
единой.
one state.
Вот это реальность,
So
которая
that's the
находится в
reality
процессе,
that is
позволяющая
being
Турции
deployed at this moment, allowing
воспроизвести
Turkey
естественный
to
род.
re-establish its presence in the Caucasus.
Что будет дальше, это
What
достаточно
will happen
неизвестно. Но то, что
next,
Турция
it's
приходит
quite
на
hard to
Кавказ
say,
через
but the fact that
Азербайджан
Turkey comes to the
и
Caucasus
терроризирует
through
Азербайджан,
Azerbaijan,
собирая его части
dismantling
Азербайджана,
Azerbaijan and then assembling
является
it as
плохим
part of
знаком.
Turkey is the reality
В
we are in.
Азербайджане армянская
So that's the
дипломатия
reality that
действительно
Armenian
своя.
diplomacy has to be
На мой взгляд.
essentially reacting to.
Скажите, давайте поговорим о таких основных
Okay,
центрах сил,
let's
да,
speak as the main
Запада,
running centers of forces. I'm in
западном
such a
мире.
center in the Anglo-Saxon world.
Вы сказали
You
да, о
said
серьезной возможности перерастания
there is the
регионального
serious possibility
конфликта
of
и его борьба с терроризмом
turning
в
that
глобальный,
regional conflict into a
глобальный
global
вопрос.
context in its fight against terrorism,
Почему
turning
так
into an
сложно
issue of global
достичь
security. So why is it so hard?
результатов
I mean, I'm sure there are
в
people
этом
watching us from the United States, Great Britain,
конфликте?
France,
Мои
Germany, I know.
почему
So why?
то, что сейчас происходит в
Why
Арцахе,
things that happen in Artsakh now
здесь, в западных странах не чувствуется
are not felt so
государства
acutely in the
Запада,
Western countries? I
конфликт
mean, they do not feel the sense of urgency, as they would call it. So
четвертое
this is like the third, fourth news in its significance, kind of
Многие
just
происходящее,
facts
оно очень
you
мало
list through,
анализируется, очень мало
very little analytical assessment, very few attempts to analyze it in depth
в
and
чем
tell
ключи
the readers what happens in fact. So, what are the interests the main countries are holding here? Let's go through that. I'm
Во-первых,
interested in your opinion.
выступает, что время
Well, we
операции
need to understand simply
достаточно
that the time for this
подходящее,
operation has been
что
perfectly chosen.
российские
I mean, that's why
прорабатывают
it
все
went
плюс-минус.
uh,
Второе,
smoothly, kind
Соединенные
of
Штаты Америки являются
planned and implemented, because United States now simply in presidential elections they don't have time for such tiny problems. Somewhere distantly, maybe global, but very small at this moment. The same way the Great Britain, some other centers of power are now fighting the COVID
они
pandemic, because COVID hits hard on the livelihoods
скажем так, видоизменяющей
globally,
существующей
because
ситуации
essentially the existing
в
order for the last 20 years
процессе
established
формирования
changes
государства
now,
достаточно активно
and
действует
in the process of reestablishment of the general picture,
российская
the larger
дипломатическая
players,
Соединенные Штаты
the bigger
Америки
powers, simply do not have time,
для анализа
resources,
глобальной, но локальной
and power to analyze maybe a small problem with global connotations, because problem in Armenia now is related to the
потому
South
что
Caucasus
глобальный центр
uh,
силы
and to the
ну,
Middle East. Yes, the global centers say it's a problem, but we can deal with it
сейчас
later
положение, да, Эрдоган достаточно
when it becomes
успешно
hotter. So
решает
in that
вопросы.
respect, Erdogan
Тоже
quite
поддержка
professionally
Канады,
planned the
нашими военными
steps. The fact that
возможностями,
France and Canada
обеспечением
found time to
территориальной
refer to our problem is
целостности,
a rare luck
то,
for
что
us,
некоторые
really.
союзы силы все-таки
That
интересуют
several centers of power still found time to look at the problem of Armenia and Artsakh is quite a success, I might say. So if you remember, after the First World War and the genocide, no one had time to deal with this because they did not understand what was happening. Well, they understood, but they were busy with other things. Today, the world is busy with other things again, and it's for the Armenians and in the world not to let our problem sink in the sea of other problems. Okay, what about Iran? Well, naturally, Iran holds its interests here. We should remember that Iran is a very difficult, multi layer, multifaceted, multi measured reality. There are centers of power inside Iran that support us and some that do not. Well, I think today the Armenian state and the Armenian nation have no reasons to criticize Iran anyhow. Iran once again shows what it can do in this phase of actions. Well, of course, they do not need radical Islamists at its northern border, and that's where we are definitely united. Iran naturally does not need destabilization of Azerbaijan that might result in destabilization of relations between Azerbaijan and Iran, and we are allies on that, but we are allies in a multifaceted state with many centers of power running at the same time. Meanwhile, we also have Armenian minority in Iran, and the Armenian people have the unique possibility of using the capacities and knowledge of Iranian society to protect the interests of Armenian people on the Iranian theater. Let's put it this way. I guess we have to be
Знаете,
dealing
здесь
with that
такая
as well.
вопрос сейчас
Well,
пришел,
there's just a question arriving,
получается,
provided the
на
conflict
политическом уровне,
is being
ну,
solved, resolved
Армении строительство,
diplomatically.
может ли
Hopefully, the
армянская диаспора
ceasefire
как-то способствовать
persists. May the
строительству
Armenian diaspora support the
администрации
process? And in
Стамбула?
which countries do you think the Armenian lobby is powerful enough to
Надо
contribute?
четко осознать,
Well,
что
first of all, we should very clearly understand that's not happening yet.
процессы и
The
проблемы решаются
processes and problems are now being solved in a military
естественно.
way, and we as a
Военное
nation with
вмешательство
large
сопровождалось
diaspora are
естественными
obliged to
причинами
solve
военных
issues of the
действий.
logistics in order
Они
to
продолжают
supply the military
продолжать.
actions. They're not uh,
И, к сожалению,
seized.
через 30 лет выяснилось, что военные
It's
инструментарий
just a
действительно
pose.
работает
So
лучше
just
всего,
10 years later, we
и
find
используется
out that the
максимально
military
для
way
защиты
is the
национальных
only
интересов.
capacity for the Armenian to protect its
И
interests.
поэтому пока что, на мой взгляд, диаспора должна решать,
So I
решать
think at this moment the diaspora should be solving,
обеспечение
quote
специфических
unquote, or without quotes,
специфических военных
the
действий.
issues of supplying the
Но
military
параллельно
power
лица
or
сегодня
supporting
и
the military
системы
process. But
международной
meanwhile, those
и дипломатии, естественно,
centers that are not able to go
оказывать
military but
содействие
solve it diplomatically
поддержке
have to start realizing
политикой и
the
дипломатией
main
обеспечения
tasks before the Armenian policies and
согласованных
diplomacy that have already started changing. Because we were saying initially that the presence
И
of
в этом
Turkey radically changes the
контексте
overall picture. And in
я
this changed world and reality, we as a
хочу
nation with
сказать,
the
что
diaspora has to
важно
once again clearly
уникальные
say
инвестиции
what
в
issues we're
Армению,
looking at and how we may protect Armenia and
специализации
Artsakh
в
in this
Армении.
world
Это уже
where
совершенно
Turkey
другой
is
уровень.
present in the Caucasus. It's a completely different task.
Осознать это, осмыслить
So
надо
to
максимально
understand it, to
быстро.
realize it, we have very little time
Для
really
того, чтобы это понять и
to
сформулировать,
understand, to formulate, to establish the new tasks
Я вот
before the
буквально
Armenian
касательно
policy. Okay,
этого
let's then speak
понятия
about that necessarily
вот
because I'm also quite interested in
смотреть,
that.
взглянуть вперед.
I try to look ahead kind of, but
Вопрос,
before I ask the question,
связано с одним из
which
ключевых
is one of
моментов.
the key questions
Как
for us at this
сложилось
moment, please tell us.
да, вот мы видим факты гибели
Well, we're
мирных
looking
жителей,
at what
которые
happens.
на
Peaceful people are just being
обустроенных
killed,
жилых
and there are
районах.
attacks at
Сегодня
the
мы видим
civilian
определенные
infrastructure, and the
провокации
church is
противостояния.
damaged. Are there rules
Почему
of military
Азербайджан
actions,
их не придерживается и
customary
пока
rules,
воплощает
and
в
why
жизнь?
wouldn't Azerbaijan follow them, and what could be the consequences for a state that would not follow such rules or behave that way?
Но я в данной проблеме выделил
Well,
две
I would
составляющие.
underline two
Первая составляющая –
compository parts
Азербайджан
here. First
придерживается
is the
принципов
behavior of
международного
Azerbaijan
права.
after the big
К сожалению,
ceasefire of
с
94.
негласной
Unfortunately, Yes, for us, yes, unfortunately for us, the Azerbaijani leadership at the time chose the path of building a Nazi state. Azerbaijan quite deliberately chose the path of establishing, of building a Nazi state based on hatred towards Armenians. The word Armenian was just prohibited, quote unquote, in Azerbaijan, and that was the hatred which was in the foundation of further building of their state. Hatred towards Armenian became one of the elements of the Azerbaijani identity as a young state and a young nation. Azerbaijan is not the first one taking that path. There is sufficient literature when young nations and peoples choose the path of consolidation of a new identity on holding sacred wars. And you will find references in my books to that jihadist as well. Azerbaijan is not unique here. It's a path many states have chosen. So on that path, on that road for the last 30 years, Azerbaijan grew a generation that hates Armenians and everything Armenian. So naturally, this way, it put itself into a trap because when you build, when you have a Nazi state built, you have to act as a Nazi state. And Nazi states, essentially, they act the same way, all of them, and ultimately end up with what we see. That happened during Nazi Germany when the great, bright German nation degraded to that level. The same thing's happening in Azerbaijan. Any state that chooses Nazism for solving some political issues degrades, putting the international community before the necessity to destroy that Nazi system and let some time for its nation to get itself cured from it. Because I frankly haven't seen a case when the nation itself would cure from Nazism. That's the first part of the problem. The second part is once again, we discussed it, the involvement of Turkey in global jihadism and international terrorism for the purpose of solving its problems. Well, Turkey quite deliberately applies that tool and ultimately ends up with the ideology of jihadism in its actions. And that circle of people and that ideology is anti civilizational. It's a destructive ideology in its nature, in its genetic code of global jihadism. We see the destruction of traditional societies, of civilizations. We saw that in Afghanistan. We saw the Buddha statue was destroyed. We saw that in Libya. We won't speak of that here. It's a natural behavior for such a power. And that power was brought from Turkey to Azerbaijan, to the Caucasus. And naturally, that power will simply destroy everything traditional, everything established in the Armenian civilization and the Armenian culture and the culture of Islam, of the traditional Caucasus or Caucasian. So it's inevitable because I may repeat, it's the nature of those powers that live that way. They work that way. So that's where two problems coincided. Both Turkey and Azerbaijan, moving in their own directions, ultimately ended up in building of a state that would strive for destroying everything traditional. So we got a country outcast, sharpened, quote unquote, upon destruction. Azerbaijan may not act differently, and is a serious problem for the centers of power, but they are now busy with the larger issue, but it's a problem for the Armenian nation. Very specific one. We should be looking for a solution, and that solution, I suppose, should not only be military. We should be thinking of the political and diplomatic one as well. Hopefully, we'll speak of that in the end.
Здесь интересный вопрос, Владимир.
You know, an interesting question from Vladimir Shakaryan.
Использование
Will
оружия.
there be an investigation of the use of banned weapons applied in Artsakh, and in what terms, I may add? That investigation, well, that's for the jurisprudence, the humanitarian law, but that's what happens after the war. Armenian jurisprudence, I mean, lawyers have to be dealing with this issue But at this moment, the whole Middle East is just
это стало, к сожалению, обыденностью. И каким образом
full
израильтяне
of that problem. That turns into something routine. And how Armenia is going to be reacting upon that is an issue of the future, but we
армянская
should be looking at even more
дипломатия
important
не
problems at this moment.
позволяет
Armenian
участвовать
diplomacy and
в
international law
союзах.
would
У нас есть
definitely have to deal with this problem. I'm sure we have great specialists here,
наверное, да, я бы сказал, что
and I may say
она актуальна. Висящий
I
вопрос.
may bring
Мы должны
another
осознать, что армянское
parallel thought to
государство
this. We should understand that the Armenian state is over
борьбы в экзистенции.
is under significant
Поэтому все
pressure. I mean,
такого
we're
рода
looking at the struggle for
это
existence.
абсолютно
And
естественные.
this is an existential struggle. So all those initiatives that might look
Реализовывать
quite natural and understandable
не
have to
пытаясь
be realized in
согласоваться
parallel, have to
чисто
be implemented in parallel without attempts to agree and get
согласовывания сейчас просто не хватит.
permits to coordinate that with the Armenian state, because the Armenian state per se simply
Во всех
doesn't
такого.
have the power for that coordination. That's why our diaspora in all of these kind of projects has to
Ведь в
act
известном
on its own completely, and in the best case, inform the Armenian state that they had done certain things,
соответствующий уровень
because
диаспоры
presence of specialists
позволяет нам
in the
говорить, что
diaspora allows us to say that the decisions that will be made by such specialists will not at all be in conflict with what Armenia is going to be doing. So
я надеюсь,
that is
что
why I may
армянская диаспора
advise,
будет предпринимать
and I
самостоятельные
hope that Armenian diaspora will
ждать
be taking
демократических
its own steps without
трансформаций,
waiting for the
создания
hierarchy
мировых, к
coordination,
сожалению, мировых
establishment of
сообществ,
hierarchy. Unfortunately, we not
которые
don't have the ability to act that way. This has to be a process of self-organization. It have to be horizontal connections inside the diaspora solving pan-Armenian, all Armenian issues, because Armenian hierarchy and state institutions are now overburdened with the war for existence. There's a comment here, question by Irina Gazazian about the role of the diaspora in the formation of the discourse in the respective countries about the real situation in Armenia. Thank you for answering that. I know that there's quite a large number of petitions being developed in different countries of the world. There are rallies, campaigns. I think everyone has heard that. Uh, I was just recently told by one of my good friends that in fact when there is a publication in the media which is not correct, which is incomplete, then at least in democratic societies, it is always possible to send a letter to the editorial, and the editorial will look through it. And there are precedents when certain publications were simply removed. Uh, so this is what the diaspora is completely able to do. We don't need any system of organization. I mean, you're just reading an article. If it does not clearly, correctly, or completely present the situation, you may always write to the office and request removal. These are tiny points I think we can do. I mean, without spending a lot of time. So this how war is being served now is unfortunately far from what we can hear from you. Let's move now to the main point of what should our steps be in this ceasefire, and what are the paths or the roads, the crossroads we're at maybe. So there are other questions. Will there be a Kosovo scenario applied for Artsakh?
выходим именно на данные
Well, we are now moving
что
to
произошло, что
the
получилось
following step,
обеспечить
to
защиту
following range of questions. We
нас
succeeded in defending the borders
в ходе военных
uh,
действий. Это значит,
through the military
и мы только что выяснили с
actions.
вами,
And while
что
talking to you,
вывод, что
we
военного
came to
пришло к
a
пониманию того, что военного
conclusion,
решения
to
не
the
существует.
understanding that there is no military solution to the problem. It does not exist.
Азербайджанский конфликт
If a local Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict had uh, theoretically hoped for some solution in Madrid principles and OSCE, etc. At the moment, the conflict turned into something regional and maybe global, then the whole nature thereof simply excludes military solutions. And in such a situation, we should be thinking of how Armenia may respond to this challenge. What could the Armenian response be? In my opinion, uh, the Armenian side has to apply all of its resources for the goal of international recognition of Artsakh. If the goal for Turkey and Azerbaijan is destruction of Artsakh, then our response to that is the possibility of recognizing Artsakh as a state. If we solve that issue, then the problem is not local anymore. We solve the issue of Artsakh, and by that, we essentially solve the issue of its locality. I mean, Azerbaijan is deprived of the motivation to start a war. Turkey has no motivation of supporting Azerbaijan, etc., etc. So, I mean, such an a disproportionate or asymmetric response from the Armenian party, if it reaches recognition of Artsakh, simply simplifies simplifies the issue, removes some sharpness and acuteness, and the main issue is solved. If the question is saving Artsakh, then the recognition by the international community helps us change the balance of powers established at this moment. How possible it is and are we able to do that is something we should be thinking about. Let's think then.
Здесь давайте немножко подумаем о том,
And really about this
роль
because
государственных институтов и здесь
the role here is given also to the state institutions and to the soft power by the
как,
diaspora as well. So,
как вы видите этот сценарий?
how
Какие
do you see the scenario and what resources we should be mobilizing at this moment that were not mobilized previously so that there is recognition? Well, the narrative's quite translucent, isn't it? From the first day the problem emerged in 1988 in the post Soviet territory, essentially, from that moment, Azerbaijan, step by step, mentions the issue of destruction of Artsakh, military solution to the problem, 1988, 1994, 2016, etc. So, if they try to exterminate a nation, a state, in order to solve some problems of territorial integrity, then maybe that nation has to be recognized so that it is protected from such intentions, physical and political extermination. In this situation, the Armenian side, with the whole story of the conflict, essentially uh, implies recognition. But here we should be considering the interests of the centers of power, and the Armenian side has to quite clearly analyze who may be interested in such a solution, who the interested parties or stakeholders are, who the allies are, and respective steps have to be made, because naturally there will be centers of power that will be against such a recognition, like Turkey. Okay, which countries do you think could become those centers of power we should be cooperating with, and what resources we may need for that? Well, the centers, we should be thinking. It's quite hard, because the escalation of such a problem, uh, I mean, the problem changes now. The imperative, the urgency of recognizing Artsakh forms right now. We thought we had more time for negotiations and persuasions, but it turned out that we have to make clear specific steps now. So some Western centers we may rely on, France, Canada, quite determined, I may say, in their readiness to discuss. United States of America, well, switched off at this moment for us because of the elections. We will wait for the results of elections and then start building our relations with the power that wins in the elections in the United States of America. Well, I guess that's enough for the start because other centers are more complicated. Respectively, we should be looking at harder tasks to implement. But ultimately, we should get to the point where we explain to the world that Turkey and Azerbaijan are looking at the point or possibility of exterminating Armenians. and finishing the process of genocide that was initiated by Turks in the beginning of the 20th century. Fortunately or unfortunately, Erdogan speaks of that in his statements quite unequivocally, and which once again prompts to the Armenian side that he means finishing the genocide process, and the solution and salvation for the Armenian nation is the recognition of the problem and the defense or protection of the respective state from that genocidal attempt. So the picture is quite classical, I might say. For a century, the diaspora used the term of Metzyeren, uh, or the genocide. So essentially, we now look at the issue of recognition of Artsakh as a possibility for salvation of the Armenian nation, respectively stopping the genocidal attempts of Turkey. I think it was quite reckless and obscure to try to kind of divide these problems. But the post-Soviet period, uh, that was happening, by the way, in the post-Soviet period. I mean, when they're trying to divide the genocide recognition from Artsakh recognition, etc. And somehow we allowed putting ourselves into a discourse where the Nagorno-Karabakh problem of post-Soviet and Soviet periods was a separate element, but not part of the Armenian issue. It was a mistake. If we had looked at these problems jointly, we wouldn't have faced the shock, the surprise. And once again, we simply heard that yes, this is a genocide and we're going to finish it. We're going to complete it. So now, quite urgently, we have to bring these two issues together, these two very important parts of Armenian diplomacy. There is no Artsakh problem separate. There is no separate issue of Artsakh recognition, and both the first and the second are the main elements of saving Armenian nation from the genocide, not allowing the state to complete it, the one that started it 100 years ago. So it's quite a transparent, understandable narrative. Unfortunately, not even a narrative. It's not narrative, it's reality. You know, that reality of Armenian life. I mean, it's not a narrative we should build. It's the life of the Armenian nation. The life essentially makes us solve the problem. We should not fantasize around it. We should not be building any theories here. This is the narrative, that's the discourse that is formed in the Armenian reality. And in this respect, the whole power of the Armenian diaspora, accumulated for 100 years, has to be rearranged and concentrated upon the recognition of Artsakh as a component of saving us from genocide. So we have to be doing that urgently. We have to start yesterday, as they say, bringing these two problems together, and that's where all of our work of 100 years will ultimately be used for recognition of Artsakh. If you want to solve the issue of Armenian genocide, we're obliged to solve the issue of recognition of Artsakh. Recognizing Artsakh is the first inevitable urgent task Armenian nation has to be looking at. So this disruption, this tipping point has to arrive as soon as possible because we don't know how long this ceasefire will last, a month or a day or a year. And that one day that we have has to be used for concentrating the whole Armenian military, no, not military, the whole Armenian diplomatic and political soft power in the diaspora for the recognition of Artsakh.
Интересный вопрос,
A
Михаил.
very interesting question asked by Mikhail
Честно
Ayrumian.
говоря, тоже это волнует, потому что на
Well,
самом
I'm
деле
frankly also
такая
concerned with that because, in fact, the recognized territory is not a protection from aggression or immunity. We know that many recognized territories are ultimately also attacked militarily. So, how may recognition solve the problem? It's a myth that They will continue attacking on recognized Artsakh. Well, of course they will attack recognized Artsakh. Solving the diplomatic political part of it is not a substitution for the military one, but the military, I'm sorry, but the political and diplomatic recognition of Artsakh and further unification with Armenia simplifies our task on the military platform. It's just a support to solve the issue in the military way. It stays, it remains. The issue of existential threat remains against Armenian statehood and nation by Turkey and Azerbaijan. This is not simply dissolved by recognition, it's simplified by recognition, and the military task remains. We do not replace one with the other. We complement the military problem, I mean, the solution on the military arena by the contributions from the political and diplomatic part, which might reduce the burden, at least by 1 gram. But it reduces the burden. If the diaspora is not able to directly participate in the war, or I mean, they can, but very limited way. The rest of the diaspora should be focusing on the arena we're looking at, and they can work there. Of course, the diaspora is not going to be the spectator
Я просто попытался сформулировать
of what
задачу.
happens. I just tried to formulate the issues before the diaspora at this moment.
Здесь тоже интересный очень вопрос от Ирины.
An interesting question from Irina Razaryan. I'm trying to translate. It's a little hard for me to translate. From which language are you translating?
Что вы говорите?
Да, я слышу.
No, I'm fully yes. Yeah.
С точки зрения сделать армянское
What should the Armenian diaspora do, in your opinion?
про Россию, может, вы
There's also a question about Russia here, maybe apparently addressed to Russia as well. So that
на самоопределение
the right of the nation to self-determination
дать вопрос
outweighs the issue of territorial integrity of Azerbaijan.
принято
So that the solution
в пользу признания независимости Арцаха. И хочу на самом деле
Yes.
сделать маленькую ремарку, одну себе позволю.
taken. And I'd like to reserve a possibility for a remark to myself. My colleagues from the Future Studio Center, our analytical center, today made a very interesting analysis of this specific issue. You may get that, I mean, it's accessible on our website, Future Studios. But now I'm coming back to you, Hratchya, and expect the answer to that question because it's a concern for many at this moment. Well, in fact, this is what happened. If in post-Soviet period we had the possibility of gravitating around the Artsakh problem, trying to understand the ways of self-determination, then now, due to the behavior of Turkey and Azerbaijan, I mean, in this war, gave some additional arguments to the Armenian nation. I mean, they brought in the jihadists, international terrorists, and they involved
Которая могла бы связать проблему Метья-Верна, проблему национального самоопределения.
bringing it to the South Caucasus. Well, I think by
И тогда проблема национального
connecting self-determination to the threat of
Сказанной-
international terrorism, we'll be able to achieve it.
международного джихадизма, глобальной войны
It's
с
an issue
террором.
of
И это облегчает
self-determination, essentially. So, in fact, it has to deal with terrorism, and it definitely simplifies the process because the problem is now recognizable, is identifiable. If the self-determination right is quite obscure and elusive and may work during the collapse of empires, different because it's connected to international terrorism. So it's easier to argument why Artsakh should be recognized. We are attacked by global terrorism. Thank you very much. You know, I may reserve another question to my own self, if you don't mind. I will allow myself some frankness, referring to one of your posts that truly resonated in my understanding. You wrote, where was Turkey mistaken? Where was Azerbaijan mistaken? We should not create the feeling of absence of ways of survival and being doomed to death. A nation that's put into such a condition turns into a different reality. In ancient Chinese thinking, that situation is called the place of death. For the European ears, that's a little worrying and concerning, but in fact, it's correct. Death is the required phase of resurrection. To resurrect and become new reality, you have to die. And we are going through that phase as a nation now. What did you mean? Well, I think I wrote what I meant. We are now closing the post Soviet page of development of the Armenian nation, closing that page by a war. We're dying as a post Soviet reality, as a post Soviet statehood. Armenia, as a post Soviet nation, dies in this war. And by dying in this war, we will either be reborn in a different reality, in different Armenia that solves other issues, not those of post-Soviet period, or we die completely and vanish. Every death is a new birth, a possibility of new Armenia. Unfortunately, the post-Soviet period was not very successful for us. We were solving issues of survival. We survived. Hopefully, the new Armenia, the one reborn, will not be looking at the issue of the survival, but development. Because survival and development are two different modes. When you survive, you don't solve the problem of development well. So I hope really that we as a nation, as a global nation, will finally start solving the issue of development, solving other global issues for our own selves. But for that, we need to close the post Soviet page. If we are able to get recognition of Artsakh on that page, establishing one unified Armenia with Artsakh inside, that clearly understands its role in the new world, because it also turns out that the world collapses and those well-established order in the world that reigned for the last 600 years at least also breaks down. There will be a new world. There will be no old world after COVID. There will be different geopolitics, and Armenia dies in the old world, in the old system of coordinates. Respectively, we as a nation have the opportunity, the unique opportunity, to look at the issue of resurrection. So we have to solve the issue of saving Artsakh today. I mean, we went up into philosophical ideologies, but we're still going to be grounded, and that ground is Artsakh, the soil of Artsakh. That's Artsakh. All these ideas should not be grounded, but should be accumulated and earmarked for the solution of the issue of Artsakh, saving Artsakh through recognition, international recognition. And if we see that we're not able to ensure, because we don't have the power, we will take tougher methods and simply recognize Artsakh by Armenia. Armenia recognizes Artsakh. We unite. If we're alone in this world, then we understand that, and we continue in a different world. I would like to thank you and thank everyone who was listening for the interesting questions. Also, thank you. Take care, Hratch. Stay healthy, and I hope there will be other opportunities to discuss. We'll pray for you. We think about you. Well, pray and work. Don't only pray. Yes, prayers will save this world. Distinguished colleagues, friends, I'm sure you can request friendship with Hratch on Facebook and hear his comments. His idea is very interesting indeed about everything that happens in Russian, but Google Translate will definitely help us with translation. So follow the news and follow the posts. Follow Hratch and hear his expert opinion about everything that happens now. Thank you very much. Thank you and goodbye.